Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very humble thank you on my part to Paul for his very generous and kind introduction. Too generous, I think, Paul, but thank you very much. Appreciated nonetheless. And I'm delighted to see you all here this evening, to see friends, colleagues, former colleagues, and people who are yet to become friends or colleagues. So thank you very much for coming on a Friday night in London. There are plenty of alternative ways to attract your attention. So I'm delighted that you've felt able to spare some time to come and hear what I have to say this evening. So when you looked at my title, you might have thought that that's a bit ambitious for a lecture that's scheduled to last no longer than an hour. In fact, will be less than that because I want to allow time for questions. And of course, it is way too ambitious. And so I won't be able to deal with that breadth. What I do hope I'll be able to do is to say something about school leadership and management in some Commonwealth countries, particularly developing countries, where the need is greatest, as you will readily recognise. So this is what I'm going to try to do in the time that I have available today. I want to stress what many of you will know anyway, the importance of leadership and management for school and student outcomes. And there's plenty of evidence on that now. To have a look at something around the status of educational leadership in the Commonwealth, particularly in the developing Commonwealth. To look at how principals are prepared and selected in various countries, where we have some evidence, but by no means enough. And then to think about how principals lead. What are their styles of leadership in Commonwealth settings? And then, rather boldly on my part perhaps, to propose an agenda for school leadership in the developing Commonwealth. I'm going to try, as much as I can, to be professorial and analytical in this presentation, but if I move into campaigning style, you might think is appropriate in the pre-election period, then please forgive me for doing so, because I feel very strongly about some of these issues and the neglect of some of these issues. And I want to say something about that later on. Let me move forward from there. So some of this will be very obvious to you, but you will see when we move deeper into the presentation why it's important. What we've seen is a change in the language in which our field has been described, particularly in the 21st century, with what we used to call administration and then learned to call management and now learn to call leadership. Very much reflecting the activities of leaders in schools around the world. I've suggested elsewhere that these changes are mainly semantic, but there may also be some factors of substance in doing that. Both of them say something about leadership enactment and leaders' behaviour. What we've seen more recently is the way in which management has been marginalised into an activity that's primarily about implementation, rather than being about formation and action. And we have become concerned about managerialism, as we call it, where the procedures become more important than the substance. And you will have heard, as I have heard, travelling around the Commonwealth and other developing contexts, when you ask people why they do something, the answer is a variation of its procedure. So no substantial reason offered for that. What we do know is management is associated with formal roles, and as we'll see later, formal roles are particularly powerful in Commonwealth contexts. And with that is the link to hierarchy, with which many of you will be familiar. Leadership, in contrast, is based on influence rather than formal positional power. And they influence followers to behave in particular ways. Although we also have shared leadership models where, of course, it's harder to decide who is the leader and who is the follower. But that's for another day. There's been a big emphasis on vision in recent years and having this notion of a better future for your school and your organisation. What we also see is whereas the literature talks about this being specific to the needs of a particular school, in very centralised contexts, how can you do that when you have prescriptive government policies that need to be followed? Because of the link between vision and values, we have to ask the question, whose values are they? Are they teachers' values, are they leaders' values, or are they government values imposed on schools and teachers? So let me briefly rehearse what many of you will know about the relationship between leadership and student outcomes. And I want to stress this because later on in the presentation, I'll be complaining about the way in which international agencies have neglected leadership, either because they haven't understood this relationship, in which case we need to make it clearer, or for other reasons as yet unexplained. So we know that both internal and external variables affect the relationship between leadership and student outcomes. So we have all these issues I mentioned here: social class, race, ethnicity, parental attitudes, and poverty. And as I will explain later, but you will know anyway, poverty is a huge factor in much of the Commonwealth, and of course has all sorts of negative influences on education and schooling. The internal factors focus on classroom teaching and on leadership. But as we've seen from recent research, if you look at the very well-known research by Leithwood and his colleagues back in the 2000s, the 27% of variation in student outcomes can be explained by leadership. Hence the puzzlement at its neglect by international agencies, about which I'll say a little bit more later. And many of you will know this sweeping phrase from the Leithwood research. Not a single documented case of a school turning around its pupil achievement trajectory in the absence of talented leadership. I pause just for a moment while you reflect on that. This leadership challenge, though, is much greater in developing contexts than it is in developed contexts like this one. So let me turn then to Africa. Much of my work in the Commonwealth has been focused on work in Africa. And more than a third of Commonwealth countries are African. And of course, they're amongst the most deprived and amongst those which are developing contexts. So just a few pointers here from work that I've done in South Africa, and which have been done by others as well. So what do we learn? Learners are often poor and hungry. We know from the establishment of breakfast clubs in the UK the very clear evidence that hungry children don't learn. How much more profound is that as a problem in the African context? We know also that schools are very poorly equipped. So in my work in South Africa, ostensibly one of the richer countries in Africa, I have been to schools which are held under the trees, no buildings. And you can imagine, of course, what happens when it rains. Right? That's the end of class for the day. So there are challenges there. And I've also been in schools which are in the most appalling conditions there. Despite the ending of apartheid 25 years ago, there is still a huge chasm between the quality of education in the formerly white middle class parts of cities and what happens in rural and township contexts. And of course, those very poor facilities are evident in many other Commonwealth countries as well, to our collective shame. We also know that teachers are inadequately trained, or may not be trained at all. There are many untrained teachers working in schools in Africa. And principals are very rarely trained as leaders. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But what we effectively see in many of these countries with top-down leadership and management models is what I call the chessboard model of leadership selection, where someone in an office somewhere moves a person from teaching in this school to being a principal in this school the next day, leading to the question, which you can well imagine, what am I supposed to do now? If they're not trained, they're not prepared, they're not developed. I'll say more about that later. So a little bit more about the African leadership context, building on what I've said already. Many children do not complete primary education. You'll remember that in the Millennium Development Goals, almost 20 years ago, that's somewhat of a scary thought, that having all children accessing primary education was a major goal, and there has been some success in moving towards it. But many do not complete primary education, sometimes due to early marriage, sometimes for other reasons. We know that African countries have weak economies. There's poverty, there's fragility. They're vulnerable to climate change. We've seen lots of demonstrations today around the world about the impact of climate change. Developing countries are less resilient in dealing with those problems than we are here. And we know there's inadequate human and material resources, a lack of books, lack of classrooms, lack of desks. I have seen children crowded together in classrooms where there are not enough chairs, not enough desks. Some are standing up. 2 children share a single chair. It's heartbreaking, honestly, to see that happening. And then they're supposed to compete on a level playing field with children here or in the US. We need to do more. Then, of course, there are issues of violence. We all know about the genocide in Rwanda. 2 former doctoral students of mine from Rwanda would tell me in the most graphic way their experience of violence in Rwanda. And we know also about problems in northern Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa. Of course, all of that has many, many dysfunctional consequences, but one of which is reduced access to education, inevitably. And then there's a problem of health problems, drought. Parts of southern Africa, in the middle of the rainy season right now, it has not rained for months and months and months. This is the rainy season. And so this creates all sorts of problems for the general population, let alone for schools, teachers, and children. Lack of clean water is another problem, and of course disease. Malaria remains widespread throughout the developing parts of Africa. And then of course we have cultural problems, corruption and nepotism amongst them. So my regular visits to South Africa, you cannot move more than 5 or 10 minutes away from the airport in a hire car before the police will stop you and accuse you of some transgression, which of course you never had, in order to take a bribe from you. Because I've been around the block a few times, so I don't pay any such bribe, but I guess lots of tourists do. And what a wonderful start to your holiday in South Africa that turns out to be. Enough of that. So let's have a look at knowledge production. Knowledge production, of course, provides some evidence of the extent to which work on school leadership is going on. And you can see here that these countries, and this is Hallinger's work, these countries have these published outputs in what Hallinger calls the core leadership journals, which of course includes Email, the Belmas academic journal. So South Africa is very dominant with its 160, Nigeria 98, and then the numbers after Kenya drop away quite a lot. I've included Zimbabwe in this, despite its ambiguous status with the Commonwealth, because they've been traditionally a Commonwealth member. And whereas Commonwealth institutions and governments may wish to punish the Zimbabwean government, of course the ones who suffer the punishment are the people of Zimbabwe and not the government. I'll move away from political posturing now. And then you can see the other countries there, Botswana, where I've had the pleasure of working with the university, Tanzania, Ghana, Uganda, and then it drops away alarmingly. Now, what does this tell us? In some sense, we say it doesn't matter if there aren't academics writing about leadership, that doesn't matter. But it tells us something about the capacity available to bring about change in schooling in those countries. Because I say something about this later. One aspect of capacity is what universities can offer. Well, of course, there are other providers and contributors also. So I think this is quite a powerful piece of research that Philip Hallinger has carried out. We haven't got figures in quite the same way in the Asian Commonwealth, but what we do know is there's substantial literature in Singapore and in Malaysia, and I'm delighted to hear Paul say that next year's conference, the CCEAM, will be held in Malaysia. I currently have 8 PhD students in Malaysia, and I'm encouraging them to attend the conference, as you might well imagine. We have much less literature available in India and Pakistan. These are huge population countries. Huge. They barely register in terms of leadership activity and publications. There's also very little activity in Bangladesh, Brunei and Sri Lanka, although the University of Nottingham in Malaysia is engaged in a program of work in Bangladesh at the moment, funded by the World Bank. I like the quote from Sapri, who's talking mainly about India, but making this point more widely. Educators in most of these countries have unquestioned adherence to the assumptions of bureaucracy. What do we understand by the phrase unquestioned adherence? Take it for granted, think it's normal. Because that's what they've grown up to expect, and it's become part of their culture. I'll say a little bit more about that later. I'm indebted to Paul, who very kindly loaned me his book on education in the Caribbean, Commonwealth. I must return it to you, Paul. Thank you very much for the loan. I promise not to take it away. But what he points out there is there's no unitary definition of school leadership in the Caribbean, because we're talking about many countries here, scattered over quite a wide range. But what I found interesting, lots of things were interesting in the book, what I found particularly interesting was that most countries allocate budgets for principal development. That's not true of most countries in Africa or in Asia. There are also perceptions of ethnic factors in accessing school leadership. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, I've had the pleasure of being in Trinidad when the Trinidad partner of Belmas opened its society there, and a former student of mine at Warwick, Freddie James, is the president of that organisation. So the issues of ethnicity and race, which still challenge us here in the UK, are not absent in other parts of the world as well. And as Paul points out, the appointment of principals is political, heavily influenced by the sitting MP. And of course, that is a global issue too, within and outside the Commonwealth. Try being a principal of a school in China if you're not a member of the Communist Party, or in Malta if you're not a member of the governing party. I could go on. So there are issues there as well that we need to think about. So what do we know about leadership styles in Commonwealth schools? So first of all, there are many leadership models, many leadership models. It's what I call crowded territory. And what is particularly significant for those of us wanting to help in developing the Commonwealth is these were developed in the affluent West. Nearly all of these models were developed in the US or in the UK or perhaps in Australia, and then applied, often without any adaptation, to Asian contexts, African contexts, Caribbean contexts, a conceptual version of policy borrowing, and applied normatively, often with insufficient sensitivity to the context where they're being applied. What we do know from the literature is that most principals are managerial leaders with bureaucratic and hierarchical practices. And as I mentioned earlier, unquestioned adherence to those approaches with vertical accountability assumptions. So if it's an instruction from someone more senior than you, you do it. It questions the issue of how much agency leaders and teachers can have in such contexts. But I was interested to read in Paul's book Hutton's claim that high-performing principals in Jamaica enact transformational leadership. Now, when I read that, Paul, I asked myself the question, how do we judge such claims? Is it simply that transformational leadership is much sexier than administrative and managerial leadership, and it's easier to make those claims? So, for example, in Malaysia, a middle-income Commonwealth country, the government ambitious 12-year reform strategy encourages, nay, mandates distributed and instructional leadership at every stage. But the research that I've done there with colleagues shows that it hasn't happened. The only aspects of instructional leadership that have been implemented in Malaysia are those that you would associate with a control model, because that fits nicely into a hierarchical approach. The empowerment aspects, such as mentoring, modelling, professional development, and feedback, are sadly missing. And when we look at distributed leadership there, and look closely at its components, it's very little different to what we would have called delegation, which is now increasingly in the literature called allocative distribution, which is far away from the assumptions in the Western literature of such distribution being emergent. So, there are question marks to be raised about claims that are made about different styles of leadership, as you'll readily appreciate. So, given the focus of managerial leadership in many developing Commonwealth countries, let me say a little bit more about it. So, the focus here is that positional leadership is central to this process. So the position matters more than the person. So when I work with my own unfortunate students at the University of Nottingham, I ask them, we have large international cohorts, I ask them in their country, what do they see on the principal's door? In nearly all these developing contexts, you see a single word, principal. Not principal, Mrs. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. Just principal. In a very simple way, tells you that the position is more important than the person. So you can replace the person and you don't need to change the door. This principle is still valid. And so power is linked to the hierarchy. The more senior you are, the more power you have. And that power takes the form of authority, sanctioned through the hierarchy. And accountability, as I said earlier, is then vertical to the hierarchy. So the principal's accountability patterns, many such schools, are hierarchical through the district education office through to the ministry. Not accountable to parents, not accountable to students, not accountable to the community, not accountable to the teachers. All those modes of accountability are trumped. Sorry to use the word trump in this context, are trumped by the adherence to the hierarchy and those vertical accountabilities. So you give the adherence to procedure, as I've mentioned before, is given a higher priority than responding to student needs or to stakeholder needs. So wither that notion of a specific vision for a context. How is that possible in such context? And this is dominant in the developing Commonwealth, and I ask myself the question is, what is our fault? Is this our fault? Is it a product of colonialism? Now, some of you will know that my wife is from Zambia. And when something goes wrong in Zambia or elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, she turns to me and she says, it's your fault. And of course, she doesn't mean, well, I hope she doesn't mean me as an individual, as she may sometimes mean that. She means the colonial power. And so those issues are issues we still need to be thinking about. So, just a few extracts here to reinforce the point about managerial leadership in Africa. So, in Botswana, Panseri talks about performativity. Of course, we're not immune to performativity in the English context either. There's a lot of performativity. But there it is also in Botswana. And Botswana is one of the more successful education systems in sub-Saharan Africa, as I've had the pleasure to see. And then Samako and Cho talking about Ghana say it's highly centralized and bureaucratized. And then my former PhD student, Zakili Mpakazi, in relation to South Africa, talks about the regulatory dimension of leadership being more significant than other aspects of leadership there. So these are just a few snippets to reinforce the claim that I'm making, that in Africa, Commonwealth, the approach is managerial. A few bits of evidence too in relation to Asia, and of course these are huge areas, and to offer snippets of this kind, I recognise, and you will recognise the limitations of doing this, but I only have a certain amount of time, so that when I finish, the night is still young, and you can go and enjoy the rest of what London has to offer. So my judgment is that managerial leadership is a product of the colonial period, and it remains dominant. And you can see that in what's being said here. Authority invested in the principal in Pakistan with limited or no delegation. Accountability follows the chain of command in India. And as I've seen in my work with my colleague Ashley, the ambitions that the ministry has, which our research suggests are genuine ambitions, and not just smokescreens, to get principals to switch from managerial to instructional and distributed leadership have largely failed. The question is why, and actually the same evidence is there if you look at Thailand. Of course, Malaysia's northern neighbour, not in the Commonwealth. The work that Hallinger and Chen have done there shows exactly the same thing, shifting the cultural expectations of the leader, despite policy reforms. It's very difficult. They remain stubbornly in a particular way of working and leading. So I want to say a bit about leadership preparation. And by the way, on your chairs, you will see a book flyer about leadership preparation in Africa, which I have co-edited with my friend and colleague Ponce Morosi, who's hiding somewhere in the audience. Well, she hasn't gone home already. No, there she is. Hi. You've got lights in my, if I can't see, it's because of the lights. That's my excuse. So why? And I know that the BERA-CCEAM has a leadership preparation research interest group, which has been meeting today, and I acknowledge Deb as the leader of that group is here this evening. And I've written extensively about this, so forgive me for repeating what some of you will have heard before. Leadership is not simply teacher plus. You cannot simply say to the teacher, move from the classroom to the head teacher's office and carry on. It's a very different role. Now, of course, I will be the first one to say that having a teaching background is an essential prerequisite for leadership, but it's not enough on its own. So I do draw breath at those few systems around the world that appoint leaders who have never worked in schools. One of the examples from a non-Commonwealth country is Israel, where former military commanders are given a short period of training and turned into school principals. That should make sure the discipline's okay, right? But how does it help with instructional leadership, you might want to ask yourself. The other thing, novice principals will be much more confident, moving into the head's office for the first time with some preparation, make them more confident, and of course, more effective, which is what matters to students. And we know there are multiple demands all over the world. We've talked about some of them earlier in relation to Africa and Asia, the multiple demands on principals from many stakeholders. And there's also an ethical issue here. Is it fair to give someone that responsibility for hundreds of children, dozens of staff, without preparation for that role? And neither here, where of course the coalition government in its wisdom decided to dispense with a mandatory qualification for becoming head teacher here, so you can just be an untrained head teacher here as well. So we're careful not to preach to other parts of the world about the need for trained head teachers when the Secretary of State of the time denied access to a debate on climate last night, felt it was okay to dispense with that. And it makes a difference. What we know is it makes a difference. So if we look at Singapore, which leads the PISA rankings, has done for some time, there are many, many reasons. And I had the pleasure of being external examiner there, so Ron, I'm pleased to acknowledge Ron, my predecessor as BERA-CCEAM president, had also been external examiner there. The interesting issue is about why is that country dominant in the PISA rankings is a question that's often asked. Indeed, the government from time to time sends delegations They're to learn lessons about. Doesn't appear to have learned them very well, but at least they may learn those lessons. But one of the factors is the very serious way in which Singapore, a Commonwealth country, treats the preparation of leaders. In fact, I've just examined a doctoral thesis this morning from Singapore on the mentoring part of the work there in Singapore. It raises an interesting question. So why is it at the top of those rankings? It has a number of reasons. One of them is about the serious way in which leadership is addressed. It was the first country in the world to have a systematic, mandatory program for middle leaders. It was doing head teacher training as long ago as 1984. Only the US was doing it more quickly than that. So there are lots of factors, but we should ask ourselves the question, is there meticulous attention to leadership preparation a key part of that? I'm very satisfied in my own mind that it is. So, back to how do you get to be a principal? So, let's imagine you woke up this morning and you said, I'd like to be a principal. Maybe some of you perhaps already are. Most principals do begin their careers as teachers, as I mentioned earlier. And principals often do little or no teaching. So I find it fascinating that as you move through the position of being a classroom teacher through to middle leadership, where you do a bit less teaching, through to senior leadership, where you do a bit more less teaching, to a principal where you do none, you gradually move away from the profession for which you have been trained and take up a profession for which you have not been trained or prepared. I'd like to see the rationale for that being carefully explained to me, other than I could save some money by closing the Quango. This links to the criteria for appointing principals. So in some countries, you need to be prepared. In the US and Canada, you can't even be appointed as the vice principal without a master's degree in education administration. And there are plenty of other places where it's mandatory, Singapore and China included in those. But in many, many countries, in the developing Commonwealth in particular, only a teaching qualification and experience are required. But as we've also seen from Paul's work, perhaps also political connections. In some contexts, political connections may be more important than your teaching experience and qualifications. Thank you. Well, I touched a nerve there. Okay, so what do we know about leadership preparation in the Commonwealth? What we know is most Asian and African countries do not provide specific preparation for school leaders. I've mentioned Malaysia and Singapore already. Botswana does so. Botswana has a very interesting program, which I had the pleasure of examining, I suppose you'd say, 3 or 4 years ago, where they take their primary teachers, or primary head teachers rather, who are not graduates, and give them the opportunity to attend a 4-year, full-time, let me pause, 4-year, full-time, mid-career bachelor's degree in education with a strong focus in leadership, with twin objectives: to move their primary headship force into an all-graduate profession and to make sure that they are skilled and developed as school leaders. A very good program. I had, as you might expect of me, those of you who know me, I had some suggestions for improving it, but the principle of it seemed to me to be absolutely excellent. Of course, to do that in a large scale would be a massive challenge, wouldn't it? Perhaps impossible to do. But sometimes you need to look at outlier models of preparation and think about how you can get close to that, but with less resource. Kenya has programs, but as Janet Okoko's important work, and I do commend Janet Okoko's chapter in the Morosi and Bush book, see the flyer, sorry about the commercial break. She notes that it's stuck in a colonial legacy, not based on local knowledge. Now, here's a challenge for all of us interested in these things. Let us not develop a one-size-fits-all model for Commonwealth leaders and export it from the UK to Africa, Asia, or anywhere else. So that's what implied by Janet's analysis of the situation in Kenya. Now, of course, it creates tensions for me, perhaps also for you. Is it better to have a preparation program with these flaws than to have no preparation? There's a challenging question for us to address. Of course, the answer is no. It's not better to have no preparation. It's better to have some form of preparation. But the issue then, and it's after you answer the first question, should leaders be prepared? You go on to the second question of how. And if the answer to the first one is obvious to me, and I hope to you, if not to our political masters in various parts of the world, then you move on to that more challenging question of how this should be done. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. So Garner talks about, writing about Garner says it's based on craft knowledge. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, it means that the passing on of knowledge from current leaders to new leaders, rather than it being a program of development. So that's an interesting one to think about. And this is a chapter in the book that I mentioned earlier. And I hesitate to say anything about Lesotho with Lesotho's finest academic, Ponso Morosi, in the room, quoting her here. Experiential preparation, this is another interesting phrase, and one wonders how experiential preparation differs from craft knowledge. As you learn by doing. Right? This might also be called an apprenticeship model. And there is something to be said for that, providing the person who's supporting the apprentices themselves a model of good practice, which is not always the case. Otherwise, you reinforce bad practice if you work with an average or below average leader. So lack of adequate training for school principals in Nigeria. In Malaysia, the National Professional Qualification for Educational Leaders is mandatory for all new principals since 2013. And they have a huge national college there, which I've had the pleasure of visiting. Not sure about the outcomes, honestly, and some of the research that's been done by people there show that there are reservations amongst those trained leaders about the content and delivery of such programs, but at least they have them. And as I mentioned earlier, MPQH was made optional from 2013. I call this in the 5th edition of Theories of Educational Leadership, which you will be able to buy, or not, next year, deprofessionalizing leadership. Doesn't matter if you're trained or not. It's the amateur tradition associated with the public school. Anyone can do it. No problems if you're not trained. But again, I come back to the question asked before. China, Hong Kong, and Singapore have dominated successive versions of PISA. Is it attributable to their comprehensive and mandatory principal preparation programs, or has that got nothing to do with it? I hope that I only have to ask you the question for you to know the answer. Again, I have a PhD student who's just finished her PhD on leadership preparation in China, so I've had plentiful insights into what is a remarkable piece of work. So, a little bit more, how did I get back to that same slide again? Oh, there we are. So just a little bit of work about the impact of leadership development. You know most of this. Strong belief that preparation works, recognition that effective leadership is essential, not easy to attribute improvements to specific development initiatives. And here is the challenge, conceptual and methodological challenge. If you have a leadership preparation intervention, the assumption in a linear model, it will somehow change leadership practice. It will increase knowledge leading to changes in leadership practice. But how does that move to a change in classroom practice and then enhance student learning? I was very fortunate with my good friend Derek Glover, who many of you will know, in doing a major project in South Africa in which Ponso was also substantially involved. A huge problem that ran over several years. What we were able to show from that, because we had access to all the data, was that those schools with a principal who'd taken part in this program improved their student leaving scores twice as fast as those schools with no such trained leader. We think that's a very powerful piece of evidence to support the view that leadership preparation makes a difference. I'll leave you to reflect on that. So I asked the question earlier, who should prepare leaders? And when I mentioned knowledge production and its connection to the preparation of leaders earlier in the presentation, I raised this question. So it's quite interesting when you look at global examples of leadership preparation. So in the US, Canada, and South Africa, these programs are handled by universities. And Ponce will remember very well, because we were right at the start of this, when we asked the Director of Leadership Development in the National Ministry of Education in South Africa, who's now a good friend of both of us, as it happens, why universities? He said, they have the capacity. They have the capacity. That was an interesting response from him. Then, of course, there's some national leadership centres. Malaysia, I've mentioned, Scotland, Singapore, of course, and previously, but not now here. And then there are many NGOs that have become interested in this. So I had a small role in some work recently done by Save the Children in South Sudan. There's a challenging context. And there are many other NGOs involved. The problem is the lack of sustainability of such initiatives. What happens when the money runs out? That's a huge challenge for those of us who are wanting to bring about sustainable change in developing Commonwealth contexts. Then, of course, local government can be involved, professional associations can be involved, and they are very much so here in England. And then the key question, which I've asked a few times already, forgive me for repetition, should leadership preparation be mandatory, as it is in some contexts? So now I'm going to come to the controversial part. I do hope I don't lose anybody. Or perhaps you think I've been quite controversial already, actually. But anyway, I come to this. I've had a look in preparation for this lecture, and I want to thank Paul and Dominic for the opportunity to make this presentation. I look at this. So I looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which of course have replaced the Millennium Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 4 relates to education. So what does it say? We want to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education. Who would argue with that? Isn't that very laudable as an ambition? Goes on to say, lack of quality education is due to lack of adequate teacher training and poor conditions of schools. Now, of course, that's true. But it's also true about leadership, which is not mentioned. Now, in the build-up to those goals, I was consulted by someone from UNESCO in Paris who asked me to give him some data about the impact of leadership, because he wanted to get it included in the goals. Well, either I failed or he failed, because it didn't appear in those goals, and of course I believe that it should have done. Then let's turn closer to home, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting 2018. Their report refers to specific actions to achieve 12 years of quality education. Silent on leadership. So the question is, who was advising the Commonwealth Heads of Government? And was there advice to say something about leadership which was ignored? Or was there no such advice? I don't know. But I challenge those people involved with the Commonwealth to think about those issues. And then I turn to the Commonwealth Secretariat. Back in 1996, the Commonwealth Secretariat ran a programme of leadership preparation and development in Africa, in which I had a small role. And part of the rhetoric for such a programme was the head plays the most crucial role in ensuring school effectiveness. Without the necessary skills, many heads are overwhelmed by the task. Now, that was a decisive and, in my view, correct analysis. And it did lead to a leadership programme. And my apologies now to Amina, who I've only just met, but pleased to have met. When I look at the strategic plan for the Commonwealth Secretariat currently, 2017, 2021, barely mentions education at all. The phrase improve educational outcomes appears and ignores leadership. So my question is, what has happened in that intervening 21 years when it was a priority and now isn't mentioned? We have some key questions to ask here about. We want to improve the situation in the Commonwealth. What are we doing? What are we doing? And of course, no doubt there may be some papers hidden that are not on the website that I don't know about, in which case I'm happy to be corrected. But I ask myself the question, and I ask you the same question. Does this invisibility of leadership in these international organisations surprise you? In my case, sadly, no. Shock me? Yes. Disappoint me? Yes. Is nobody reading the research? 27% of the variation in student outcomes is attributable to leadership, and it is ignored. I did say at the beginning I would move from analytical to campaigning mode, and now you can see that I've done just that. Apologies to anyone I may be offending. None of this is personal, because I feel a deep sense of what is missing here to make a difference to those children who deserve a chance in life, which they are being denied, partly because we are not addressing this issue of leadership. So, a development agenda, me being bold. I'll feel better saying it, even if nothing happens afterwards, which is sadly often the truth. So back to basics. What are the building blocks of our field of educational leadership? Of course, you may have other ideas. I think that it's these four components: policy, theory, research, and practice. But they're rarely connected in any systematic way. We have that problem here in England. Some of you will remember David Blunkett's urge back in the New Labour years to have evidence-informed policy making. Well, that didn't last long, right? So what role does research play? Do you simply go ahead and develop policy in the absence of research? What else do you use? Well, of course, it's ideology. Beliefs. So connect these things as best we can. So I've mentioned earlier the interest that some NGOs show in leadership preparation. What frustrates me about it is each NGO does its own thing in its own area of interest, doesn't connect it, doesn't link it up. So if we have a major earthquake or other problem elsewhere in the world, we get a disasters emergency committee, DEC. Couldn't they do that for leadership? Have a coordinated program of development? If that's what they care about, I'm sure they do care about it. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute they don't care. But all these disconnected initiatives are not moving this problem away. And yes, we do need research. One of the key aspects of research that we need, which is mostly neglected, is what do the principals themselves think they need in order to run their schools better? So we need needs analysis work in all these settings, and that's why that information about knowledge production in Commonwealth countries is so important, because there are people who could join a coordinated program of needs analysis by context. Remember what Janet Okoko said earlier about it being not related to the local context. We need to do needs analysis, not present a one-size-fits-all colonial model to our colleagues in Africa or Asia or elsewhere. I mentioned here, let's be sensitive to culture and context, not produce a generic Western or colonial model of leadership. And that's a challenge, because it's easier and cheaper to do one model, right? Of course it is. Let's have one model. Much easier to do contextualised models for 54 Commonwealth countries. Now there's a challenge. Challenge and a half. Some people might say, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying. So, given the strong evidence that leadership makes a difference to schools and students, what can be done? And of course, one lecture is a drop in the ocean. But I ask the question to conclude my presentation: if we are serious about improving school leadership in the Commonwealth, what happens next? Thank you very much for coming and for listening to the presentation. Let's see.
Thank you so very much, Prof. My name is Kennedy. I am the Diaspora Coordinator of Commonwealth Alliance of Young Entrepreneurs West Africa, and I'm the founder and the CEO of Nexus Exchange Limited, which is a youth social enterprise. I'm very happy, the way you started, and I'm happy with the, when you said you wanted to go a bit controversial. Now, I've got a question. When you talked about NGOs, and even though we are not NGOs, as it were, we are a social enterprise, go ahead and do your own things and all of that business, when the Commonwealth should be leading a concerted action or a program in that area. My question would be this: why does the Commonwealth make it extremely difficult for us to reach them? Now, I have been introduced to the Commonwealth. Our work has been, the former DSGO Jumbo, aware of our work, I've been invited to lead a delegation to Fiji. The Commonwealth Education Minister has a conference, and I did make a recommendation. We need to overhaul the entire academic curriculum, especially in West African context. Now, and we've heard nothing since then. I've been trying to reach them ever since. It's been well over a year now, and nothing is coming back. So why does the Commonwealth make it very difficult for us to reach them? Now, that's one bit of my question. And then if I make my contribution, because I'm not sure I'm going to have a chance to do it again, is this. Why do we still run an education or academic curriculum that is setting up young people for failure? Now, because we're talking about most countries. I'm a Nigerian. I moved here 7 years ago. And in my country today, we still lecture people on skills that would not be required in the next 5 years. Now, that is a fact. I became a lecturer in University of Benin by emergency because the lecturer who was meant to take the course was absent. So I stood to the class of over 500 people, and I said tutorial. And then the man walked into the class and said, well, since you love the course, how about you come and teach it? I've got better businesses to do. He went to supply tissue papers. And it's so appalling. And then when I became a lecturer, I quitted after 18 months. Why? Because this same lecturer works in collaboration with the school leadership, as it were. They do not teach the courses. They expect students to pay them to get good grades. And my last point would be this. In this room, if I look around, I am sure I'm one of the youngest people here. And I'm very sure that young people are the ones who go to school, who need the education. And I've asked this question severally. Why do we exclude young people at the table of conversation when it comes to matters of them? We have over 1.2 billion young people across the Commonwealth. Why do we exclude these young people? Truth of the deal is that at the end of the day, this is going to continue. We're talking about, the leadership model. We cannot actually, as it were, develop it if we do not understand how the young people need to learn and want to learn. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think you made some very interesting points. And the first one about leadership, why doesn't the Commonwealth do more, is one I can't answer. But perhaps others can. But I would endorse the view that the Commonwealth has a responsibility to improve the situation. Oh, thank you, Amina.
I'll try. On the first point, what are we doing or what are we not doing on school leadership and management? I fully acknowledge what you've been saying about maybe a period where it's not appearing sufficiently and visibly enough. Thank you. Especially since probably 2000 and up to now. And I would like to think that working jointly with CCEAM and BERA is an indication that we are serious about school leadership and management. The Commonwealth Education Program, Learning for Life, as we call it, because for us learning is in various spaces, both formal and non-formal, has a specific point on school leadership and management. And we are, kind of still trying to, we have a little bit of a conceptual idea of what we want to achieve, and much is what you're saying about how we make it contextual and relevant to the Commonwealth countries without being a top-down approach and the Western approach. And we are discussing further with CCEAM and CCEF how we can shape a coherent program around that. So this is to say that it's very much back, forcefully, as a key area of work for the Commonwealth. I'll respond regarding the strategic plan, the 2017-2021 strategic plan. It does mention educational outcomes, health and educational outcomes. It doesn't go into detail, but it doesn't go into detail into our different areas of work and sector approach. In the same way, it doesn't mention early childhood development, which is equally important, or inclusive education, that is also an area we're looking at. So it doesn't mention education, leadership, and management, but it is to the various sections to then see how to achieve the educational outcomes, it cannot be done without proper school leadership and management. So this is to say that we hope this invisibility is over. It's coming back forcefully at the front. And I would also like to invite you to work with us to see, and with Peter as well to my left, for the 2021 Commonwealth Conference of Educational Ministers, so that it's there back on the agenda and we can present research that you may do between now and then as evidence to inform policies. And also that important link that you made between policies, research, and practice. That's one. Sorry, Paul, I'm keeping the mic. With regard to Fiji and your question and getting young people to the table, we have a Commonwealth Youth Program that has been going on for several years and which is quite solid, I would think, and which has a strong focus on youth participation and training for youth leadership. We have networks of young people working in areas of education, climate change, health, various. So at CHOGM, that will happen next year in Rwanda, there is a specific youth forum where the young people express all these issues and they are at the leadership table and they're discussing with, and they make the recommendations to the head of states. So I think we've pretty much covering that area well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amina, and I'm very happy to accept your invitation. You mentioned that. Thank you.
Two more questions, colleagues. Ian and Alison. Tony, thank you ever so much for that. And I'm sort of enjoying the thought of your wife giving you a hard time for your connection with colonialism. And I think the point that you made about Western dominance in the discourse, and just with those two, thoughts about the British Education Research Association, the British Educational Leadership Management and Administration Society.
Yeah.
Are those two Bs barriers in answering your final question, or are they facilitation for a way forward?
It's a great question, and I'm very conscious that in his introduction, Dominic mentioned the international focus of BERA, so that was a timely comment given what Ian's had to say. And of course, Ian, as well as being vice chair, of course, you hold the international brief for BELMAS, and thank you for the way in which you've been executing and carrying that forward. And there's been an ongoing debate in BELMAS, which those of you who are members will understand, about the extent to which it primarily serves a UK audience and the extent to which it sees itself as a global force for good in the areas of leadership. And I'm, as colleagues will know, I'm very firmly in that second camp. And so in one aspect, of course, as editor of Email over the last 17 years, we've seen an enormous shift and a very much higher proportion of international papers published now than was the case previously. That reflects the growing importance of the field internationally in that period, but also an orientation towards recognizing the important work that's going on in many other countries, including many developing contexts. So I hope that British in the two organisations is not a barrier. I would hope it would be a facilitator. But what we have to be careful about is what I said earlier, and is about not adopting a colonial, we know best view, and I know you don't, in case you're thinking I was implying that you do. But that we work in a facilitation role and in a joint sharing and joint learning enterprise to bring about change. Thank you.
My name's Alison Taysom from the University of Leicester, and my question really addresses your final question. And when Commonwealth countries spend a percentage of their gross domestic product on education, then if we can increase the gross domestic product, we'll increase the investment in education. Yep. And I'm just wondering to what extent, with the capitalism, but more corporations outsourcing from developed countries to developing countries on a promise of increasing gross domestic product, it seemed a good deal, but actually the outfall has been that it's been exploitation of others. And education is a way in which we could propel entrepreneurial economies by teaching people to do the work themselves and not have to be employed by corporations that are taking on almost a colonial approach. And so people are coming in and, taking the work from the people in the Commonwealth countries who could do that work themselves and employ those people. And that would increase GDP. So what my question is if we're removing leadership, was it part of some kind of misunderstanding that would increase GDP? And that through neoliberalism, which is the liberation of economies and institutions of laws very rapidly to allow trade to go ahead, which I talk about in chapter 6 of my forthcoming book, a road plan to education policy for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. What it looks at is ways in which that is really stopping people from understanding and implementing their human rights. And if we don't have leaders who teach teachers, who teach children about what it is to be moral and what it is to have human rights linked to duties, then we can just take that tier out and people get told what to do by the new colonizers of neoliberalism. So my question is, do we now need to make visible the leadership and leadership preparation, because removing it rapidly perhaps wasn't the best thing for gross domestic product in local Commonwealth countries? Thank you, Alison. I'm not sure that at least one part of the premise for your question is I'm not sure leadership has been removed as such. I think Amina, I think, has acknowledged that it's been de-emphasised to some extent until recently in the Commonwealth Secretariat, but I don't think, there's plenty of evidence of governments expressing interest in Commonwealth countries in developing these issues, but the initiatives are not sustained. And I do want to say something about the GDP point. Of course, improving and enhancing GDP is better than not doing so, but it misses an awful lot of questions about distribution of wealth. So I mentioned earlier the work I've been doing in South Africa with Ponzo and others. It's got the second worst distribution of wealth in the world. So the middle classes are doing very nicely, thank you. Poor people in rural areas and townships, their situation has barely changed 29 years after the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. Barely changed. And occasionally there are riots and other kinds of demonstrations there. I'm amazed there haven't been more. Why have they put up with it is the question I ask myself. It's outrageous. So the distribution of wealth is equally important, and alongside that we know about the appalling corruption in South Africa that eventually led to President Zuma being removed from office. We know about the appalling corruption in Zimbabwe, which led even to Mugabe losing his position, but doesn't seem to have improved with his successor. And you can multiply that across the world. So it's the GDP, one thing, the distribution is another thing, and how much is siphoned off by political leaders for their own interests, rather than the interests of the people they're supposed to be serving. And that's what worries me far more, actually, than GDP, although, of course, I understand the legitimacy of that point as well.